Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Colby College, welcome. We're glad that you're here. My name is Kimberly Flowers, and I'm the Executive Director of the Goldfarb Center for Public Affairs here at Colby College in Maine. I have the honor of being the host and the moderator for tonight's dialogue with the U.S. Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, Alejandro or Ali Mayorkas. He is the first Latino and immigrant to serve in this position. He has led a distinguished 30-year career as a law enforcement official and a nationally recognized lawyer in the private sector. He's held a number of top positions within the U.S. government, including Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security, as well as the Director of the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. He's really been at the forefront as a policymaker, dealing with and shaping and working on solutions to some of the most critical issues that our nation has faced, especially in the last 2 decades, including immigration. He led the development and implementation of DACA. He's worked on cybersecurity. He's worked on human trafficking, as well as pandemics before COVID, such as Ebola and Zika. The Secretary began his government service in the Department of Justice, where he quickly rose as the youngest U.S. State's Attorney in the nation. And he worked on a number of very important prosecutions related to topics as broad as environmental crime to public corruption. He received his bachelor's degree with distinction from the University of California at Berkeley and a law degree from Loyola Law School. He is also, and will be important to many in our audience tonight, but he is also a proud Colby parent. And this isn't the first time that he has spoken at Colby. He spoke at a Goldfarb Center event about 2 years ago on immigration policy. And well, we all can bet that immigration policy is still going to be on the table and discussed tonight. We also are hopeful to get to other topics such as domestic terrorism and racial profiling. And part of our conversation tonight will be led by Professor Crystal Kessler. I've had the honor of working with her for the past year. She's the Goldfarb Faculty Associate Director. She's the chair of the Goldfarb Faculty Advisory Committee. She's an associate professor of sociology. In fact, she'll be the chair of the sociology department in the fall. And she's done a lot of her research related to topics on social inequality and migration and on the life of an immigrant. And so a lot of the conversations that we're going to have tonight are right in line with her areas of expertise and the conversations that she's leading today in her classrooms. Before I turn it over to Crystal, I just want to say one thing to the audience. I feel like this is a real gift tonight to be able to talk to a leader in our government at this level, particularly when we're seeing such a surge on the border that we haven't seen in 2 decades. There's a lot to unpack there. And I just challenge you not to be passive. We've spent a lot of time in this virtual world now, but let's really be engaged. And so if you saw in the opening slide or if you saw it in the description of the event, we're taking live questions. So be sure to put your questions in the chat box below. And on the latter half of the program, I'll be trying to get to as many of those questions as we can. But now I'll turn it over to Crystal. Professor Kessler, over to you.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. First of all, good evening, Secretary Mayorkas. I'd like to add my welcome to Kimberly's and just say what a pleasure it is for me to have this opportunity to talk with you this evening and for all of us to hear from you. There are obviously lots of things we'd love to discuss tonight, and we certainly won't get to all of them. I'm going to start by asking you to tell us a bit about you, about your and your family's journey, and how those experiences have shaped where you are today, and especially how they shape the way you approach the challenging policy questions and ethical questions that are at the heart of your work with Homeland Security. And I'll just nod here to a number of our students who expressed beforehand that they'd really like to hear from you on this topic of the ethical principles that guide you.
So thanks very much, Professor, and I'm delighted to be a part of the conversation. So I was brought here to this country by my parents. My sister and I were brought here as refugees, escaping the communist takeover of Cuba. And importantly, that was the second time in my mother's life that she became a refugee. She fled the Holocaust, World War II, Eastern Europe, lost a tremendous amount of family in the Holocaust, in the concentration camps. And so the phenomenon of displacement, of the vulnerability of individuals, the fragility of life, what it means for people, especially a family, to be forced to flee one's home, the place where one envisioned one's future, is something that is very much a part of who I am and how I approach the issues. I think the concept of identity really is critical to keep in mind in the development and promulgation of policies. Because not only must we think of the identity of the people whom we impact, but we also have to think of the identity of our nation in terms of what we do and what it says about who we are and who we as a nation want to be.
Thank you so much for that. Well, I'm sure return to various parts of that throughout the rest of our conversation here. We're going to move now to some more specific sort of policy arenas. Obviously, our southern border looms large in your work right now, and there are all sorts of issues we could get into here. Last week you spoke to members of the Senate about the progress you've made in the last couple of months in transferring unaccompanied children who arrive at the border out of Border Patrol facilities as quickly as possible. You've also ended the previous administration's policy of turning away unaccompanied children on the grounds of COVID-related public health concerns. So there's been this definite shift in course in terms of the treatment of unaccompanied children. That shift's obviously not complete, it's still sort of working on issues of moving these children into permanent housing and so on. So I wonder if you could just sort of take stock with us here of where you think you are and your agency is with this very important, very concerning topic, and discuss with us sort of next steps in terms of ensuring the well-being of these unaccompanied children arriving at our border.
So, the southern border has indeed been very challenging. This is not the first time it's been very challenging, even in my experience in federal government. But focused on the unaccompanied children themselves, I just want to take a step back and speak to this, which I alluded to in my testimony last week. We have to understand and appreciate the vulnerability of these children and the level of desperation that their parents experience in actually being willing to place their children in the hands of smugglers to traverse Mexico to reach our southern border, or actually to send the children alone or with other strangers to take that perilous journey and reach our southern border, which in and of itself is not safe. These are loving parents. These are close-knit families, and yet they send their children by reason of the circumstances in which they live in their home countries. I just think it's very important to understand the vulnerabilities there and the lives they're fleeing. And so we as an administration made a decision that we will not expel unaccompanied children. The prior administration was exercising the public health authorities of the CDC in expelling families, single adults, and unaccompanied children. We made a decision that even though there is a public health imperative from a perspective of humanity, we would not expel unaccompanied children. Some, by the way, as young as 2 or 3 years of age. And so inheriting a system that had been torn down, we saw a significant backup in the Border Patrol stations, which captivated the public's attention, and quite frankly, not incorrectly or unfairly so. The Border Patrol stations are not meant for the care of children. And so the situation was very serious. And I deployed FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which is really operationally expert, to assist HHS in building the capacity to actually receive those children, which we are obligated to transfer within 72 hours. We were not doing so by reason of the situation. And so we increased the capacity, and we were able to move the children to HHS, to shelters and care more suitable for the unaccompanied children. We then deployed between 300 and 400 asylum and refugee officers in the Department of Homeland Security to assist in the management of the children's cases, to unite them with their parents, legal guardians, or close relatives here in the States, so that they didn't spend too long a time in those HHS shelters, because they really do belong with family. We are making tremendous now strides in reducing the time that the children spend in HHS care. We started it at an average of about 42 days. We're down to about 30, 31 days. And our goal is to be down to 7 to 10 days. We have to verify the identity of the parents, legal guardians, and relatives, as well as their suitability to care for those children. And we're re-engineering the entire process from beginning to end. The challenge is not behind us, but we've made tremendous strides.
Thank you. You know, beyond the specific issue of unaccompanied children at the border, I wondered if you could tell us how you're thinking about your priorities and your policy vision related to the overall situation unfolding at the border, and especially in terms of policies that have been in place to limit asylum claims. So both, you know, COVID-related restrictions, what you already talked about, the Title 42 expulsions, and even before that, the so-called, you know, remain in Mexico policy and so on. Just talk us through what the trajectory with these kind of restrictions is going to be, you know, going forward in the Biden administration.
So we discontinued, and this was a campaign pledge of the president, we discontinued the Remain in Mexico policy, which, just for everyone's benefit, is a policy when someone has made a claim for asylum, they are to wait in Mexico pending the resolution of that asylum claim. And an asylum claim can take 4, 6+ years. So it's a very significant, its impact is quite significant. The Title 42 authority that the CDC issues and that we implement is a public health imperative in a COVID-19 pandemic environment. We cannot safely process asylum claims of single adults and family because that process involves a congregate setting at our Border Patrol stations, at our ports of entry, and we're not equipped to do that. And what that means, just so that everyone understands and why the professor's question is so important, that means that individuals are expelled before they're even able to make a claim for asylum. We have exceptions to that for individuals with acute vulnerabilities. For example, people who make a claim that they're fleeing torture. Just by way of one example, it could be acute medical conditions or what have you. But when we get through the COVID-19 pandemic, when we no longer have that public health imperative, it is our obligation under the law to consider people's claims of asylum and to adjudicate those claims. And we're actually working on regulations to make that asylum process more efficient and to deliver final adjudications much more swiftly for people who claim asylum.
Just a quick follow-up on that. I realize the Remain in Mexico program has been done away with, but there's still, as I understand it, some processing going on with the backlog of migrants who had been subject to those protocols under the past administration. Could you tell us a little bit about where you're at with that and sort of timeline for those migrants?
So, you know, what gathered a lot of attention were the conditions in the camp in Matamoros, where people who were subject to the Remain in Mexico policy of the prior administration were gathered, and the conditions were quite substandard. So we actually were able to process all of the cases of the individuals in that camp, and we're now processing the remaining cases of individuals with active cases in the Remain in Mexico, subject to the Remain in Mexico policy. And frankly, the way we are doing that is a platform for the future. It's quite innovative and very efficient. So people with active cases in the Remain in Mexico program, they're in Mexico, or perhaps they returned to their countries of origin, predominantly the Northern Triangle countries of El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. They are able to register for our new system through the use of their phones. They can do it virtually. Then working with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the International Organization for Migration, nonprofit organizations in Mexico, and critically, the government of Mexico. These individuals make appointments to appear before those non-governmental organizations where they are COVID tested, they are isolated and quarantined as needed. They make an appointment so that they're processed through the port of entry at a scheduled time. They're transported to the port of entry, and they come through that port of entry with facility very quickly and efficiently so that they are able to actually enter the United States during the pendency of their asylum claims. It's an incredible platform for the future, and we are growing its capacity so that ultimately we're able to use it to process asylum claims outside of the Remain in Mexico program. We intend to use it as a platform writ large.
Thank you. Obviously related to this general issue of migrants seeking protection in the United States is the more specific issue of refugee resettlement, moving also away from the southern border here a bit. We've seen over the last couple of years all-time low numbers for the cap that the U.S. puts on refugee resettlement, which I know was recently changed upward, and I understand will be higher yet next year. Given your family story, especially, I imagine this one has particular significance for you, and I wonder if you could just talk us through how you think about U.S. responsibility and U.S. leadership in this policy arena of refugee resettlement.
Thanks so much. Let me, if I can, just go back for a second, because I want to make sure that everyone understands that we don't champion our use of the Title 42 authority to expel people before they're able to make a claim of asylum. We use it as a public health imperative because it is very difficult to be in a situation where we have to expel people who very well might have claims for relief, humanitarian relief, and are unable to present them to us and ultimately to an immigration court. So I don't want to suggest that it's something to champion. It's actually quite difficult in terms of our humanitarian commitments and objectives, but it is a necessity by reason of the public health imperative. I will tell you that there's not unanimity, of course, with our respect to its use. It is being challenged in the courts by the American Civil Liberties Union, by RAICES and other tremendous organizations that really advocate for the most vulnerable and for those who otherwise don't have a voice. The President Biden is an extraordinary champion of the refugee program. He has committed to admitting, well, a ceiling, I should say, of 62,500 refugees this fiscal year. We will not be able to reach that ceiling just by dint of operational realities. But when I was the director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, which has the refugee corps that travels all around the world to the world's most difficult places, the hotspots of displacement, to interview individuals to determine whether they qualify for refugee status here in the United States. When I traveled around the world, including to the Dadaab refugee camp on the Kenyan-Somali border, one of the most difficult thing I've ever seen in my life. We were received as the torchbearers of humanitarian relief in the world. We led the world in providing humanitarian relief. And over the past 4 years in the prior administration, not only did we lose that standing, but we lost our footing entirely in terms of providing humanitarian relief. Not only did we tear down our programs, but we built obstacles and barriers to other lawful pathways for immigrants to realize what America can and should and needs to be. And so I am incredibly energized about rebuilding the program, reaching that ceiling, if not in this fiscal year, but as soon thereafter as possible, and to raising that ceiling as the months and years progress, as the needs of displaced people all around the world, including in our own hemisphere, so desperately need.
Thank you. I'm gonna, my next question actually goes back a little to the issue you raised a minute ago about balancing public health risks related to COVID with, other concerns. So, I suspect that COVID-related concerns and restrictions surrounding the international movement of people, that those concerns are going to be with us for some time to come, whether we're talking about migration, travel, or tourism, any of those things. And I think, this past year for colleges and universities, we've obviously seen restrictions placed on our international students, cancellation of many of our abroad programs, concerns about students returning from those programs, and so on. So I was wondering if you could kind of speak a little bit more generally about how you do this. Like, how do you think about balancing the public health risks with those, with sort of people's needs and desires? I mean, sometimes desires, sometimes really deep needs for international mobility.
I can't overstate the difficulty of that. It's very easy when one feels that the choice before one is right versus wrong. That's easy. The challenge is when one has two imperatives that are in tension with one another. One is a public health imperative, for example, that is driven to protect, honestly, not only the American public, but the migrants themselves. And we have seen what can happen in a congregate setting involving migrants who've not been tested, isolated, and quarantined. One has an imperative on in that regard. And then one has an incredibly compelling imperative of providing humanitarian relief to a family that might very well have fled persecution by reason of their membership or by reason of one family's membership in a particular social group. And so one wrestles with these issues and one makes the best decision one thinks is warranted. And it's very difficult to leave a decision like that with a spring in one step, because the decision has benefits that are real, and it has costs that are real. And then if in fact we make a decision, as we have, in the service of the public health imperative, then it is our obligation to make sure that we do everything possible to put that public health imperative behind us so that we can execute our humanitarian responsibilities in a way that makes us proud. It's not easy. I've made a lot of very, very difficult decisions, and there are people that disagree vehemently with the decisions that I have made.
So
righteously.
Yeah, right. This is debate is productive, right? We have probably time, I think, for one more question before I turn it over to audience questions with Kimberly. For our last question, we're going to turn away from international borders and toward another immensely important issue under your purview, and that is far-right, white nationalist, domestic terrorism. I think that after January 6th, we all now realize that this is an issue that deserves far more attention than it had received until recently, even though, of course, there were alarm bells going back a ways. So I have sort of a two-pronged question here. One is more policy specific, sort of what do you think is the most important thing that your agency can do going forward to ameliorate these threats? But I'm going to end on sort of a broader question here, which is, how do you think that we can all work in this current moment toward a country in which we're playing offense and not defense against the ideologies that are at the root of this kind of violent extremism?
So the second question is more difficult than the first. The first, in terms of what we are doing to address this, and I should make certain to say that our exercise of authority is not with respect to the expression of ideologies, as harmful, hateful, and pernicious I might consider those ideologies to be, but rather focused on the connection between ideologies and violence. So one thing we're doing is making sure that our department reflects the nation that we strive to be, and that there's no violent extremism within our own ranks. Two We are disseminating information more effectively to communities across the country, to state, local, tribal, territorial authorities. So they are equipped with the threat picture that we see with our vista from border to border, sea to sea. So they're equipped to understand what might be happening or what could happen in their communities, and they are in a position to prevent it. And third, and really importantly, is we are developing programs, including grant programs that we're underway in administering, in building partnerships. Because the reality is that individuals, all too often, who are driven to violent extremism, exhibit signs of their intentions, their antisocial tendencies, their criminal inclinations. They exhibit those. And so we need to partner with communities, and we need to equip loved ones, families, teachers, etc., with the tools to detect and to know what to do. And it's not a law enforcement effort. It's a community effort in that regard, if you will, with, of course, law enforcement ramifications. But it's really the see something, say something analog in neighborhoods. And we're building that. And that's a really new paradigm. And then I think when we talk about what we can do as a society, first of all, we have to exercise our own voice, right? To address these ideologies. We have to understand the root causes. What are the factors that drive people to such a level of alienation and hate? We need to educate, and we need to educate the next generation, as well as others older, about what we stand for, what our principles and values are, and what the avenues are that are antithetical to the avenues that they might be inclined to really drive down.
Thank you so
Root
much.
causes. Root causes, Professor, are vital in addressing.
Yeah, thank you. We are out of time for this part of the conversation. I'm going to turn it back over to Kimberly, who has a number of questions from the audience that she's going to relay to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Kessler, and thank you, Secretary, for being here tonight and for answering so honestly these very complex questions. You do not have an easy job. I want to start with a student question that I got beforehand, and this comes from students who are part of our Gold Farb Executive Board. You may have heard, I know many of our audience will know, that Colby announced plans this year that we're launching the Davis Institute for Artificial Intelligence. It'll be the first cross-disciplinary institute for artificial intelligence at a liberal arts college. So AI is very much on our brains. And a freshman, Erica Lee, wants to know from you, talking about the controversial discussion of using AI facial recognition technology in your work, and how some would say that the data used for that technology depends on algorithms that may be biased or potentially lead to racial discrimination. So Erica's question is, how do you ensure that racial profiling is not implemented or used as a part of this process in technology?
So all I can tell you in response, that's a great question. All I can tell you is we are in the process of figuring that out. Truth be told, we in the Department of Homeland Security have a statutorily created Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties and an Office of Privacy. We're unique in that regard. And I have papers on my desk as I speak that addresses different options, different paths forward for the deployment of artificial intelligence and other technological innovations while protecting civil rights, civil liberties, and privacy interests. We are working on that. That is a core issue. And by the way, that issue is going to be with us for a while, not necessarily with respect to technology that is right around the corner. We'll resolve that, but this is going to be a very dynamic area of study academically, as well as within the government. And I say academically because I hope everyone is aware of how much we utilize academic studies in the development of policy and our operational frameworks. Quite a bit, actually.
That's a fantastic point. Thank you for that. So I'm going to pull in questions from the audience. We have a lot. Let's start by talking about how involved are the president, the VP, and other White House staff in daily operations related to the Southwest border crisis? And how does decision-making flow? Tell us a little bit more about that.
So the president and the vice president are very involved in the Southwest border challenge. I and others brief them on a regular basis, and then they direct action. And I will tell you one thing, let me share one thing with you about the direction we receive. And that is that both of them have a fundamental belief in the capability of government to deliver for the American people and to deliver on our values and principles. And so if in fact we are not achieving excellence, the direction we receive is stern and correctly so. They believe in what government can do and they direct accordingly. And quite frankly, it is their direction that has catalyzed the dramatic change with respect to unaccompanied children that we have realized in 30 days.
Yeah. So I want to turn back to another student question because I find this one really interesting. I know you've worked a lot on cybersecurity, and in light of the cyber attacks that have happened on enterprise and the US government, what are the long-term policy goals that you'd like to see implemented at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency? And what's your position on the department working with private companies to protect critical infrastructure? And this question is from Ben Oxel. He is a junior here at Colby.
So it's really, I would say, not necessarily from a policy perspective, if I may, but from an operational perspective, here's what I think is most critical. And that is achieving a true public-private partnership. And we at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency and across the federal enterprise have to do a better job in communicating for the private sector the value proposition in sharing information with us about cyber threats and cyber attacks so that we can raise cyber hygiene of the entire public-private ecosystem writ large. Because I think what the private sector has considerable hesitation in sharing information with the government, we are the federal government, we're here to help, is not exactly the most effective slogan. The private sector is worried about accountability, investigations, liability, and the like. But quite frankly, the threats that we face in the federal government, the private sector faces as well, and vice versa. Solar winds, the attack that galvanized, again, correctly, so much attention in the public, victimized the private sector as well as the public sector. And in cybersecurity, one is only as strong as one's weakest link by reason of the interconnectedness of us all. And so we have got to share information, and the private sector needs to share information with us so that we have an understanding of what is going on across the country, quite frankly, across the world, and disseminate information accordingly so people can take the measures they need to take to raise their defenses appropriately and as are needed.
I want to ask another question from an audience member, and the question is, how do you want the world to measure your work? And I'm going to add to that, it's very similar, but what does success look like to you? If you finish this term or don't continue on, what will you be most proud of, or how to measure success in your job?
I would say two things. One, I am not interested in incrementalism, moving the needle in increments, unless that is operationally required. I want transformative change, because that is what I think we need to achieve. And I want people to say that the transformative change that occurred achieved extraordinary security and humanitarian outcomes for our country. Made it safer and made our heart grow.
Sort of in that same vein, this is a question from another freshman, Grace Hillis. Thinking about the criminal justice system, we used to work, of course, at the Department of Justice, and the racial inequalities that system perpetuates. Are there policies or practices under your authority that you can use or change to reverse racial inequalities that have occurred in our country?
Well, remember something, we can't reverse the inequality that others have suffered already. But what we can do is make sure that those inequalities are not perpetuated in the future. Let me share with you something that I am advancing that quite a number of advocates disagree with. And it speaks to this question. There are injustices in the criminal justice system. And in the immigration enforcement system, the apprehension and removal of an individual who was unlawfully present in the United States. I use criminal history to inform whether our limited resources should be used to apprehend and remove somebody. And there is disagreement about that policy, that there is advocacy to really push against my use of criminal history, to say, Ali, you are importing the infirmities of the criminal justice system into the immigration enforcement system. That a conviction upon which you are relying and making your immigration enforcement decision may have been born of discriminatory policing practices or a court system that did not have due regard for the racial inequities. And now you're importing that problem into the immigration enforcement system. And my response is as follows. and it's unsatisfactory to some and others support it, is as follows. If I am aware of an infirm criminal conviction, which is rarely the case, by the way, but if I am informed of it, then as a matter of policy, I should not rely on it in making my immigration enforcement decision. But absent that, I cannot, it is not feasible to look at every criminal conviction and analyze it to determine whether it withstands scrutiny. That's just not possible. And I have reviewed criminal convictions to determine, when I was an assistant U.S. attorney, whether they had integrity. And it's a labyrinthian process, a time-consuming process. But absent that, if I have an individual before me who is unlawfully present in the United States and poses a danger to public safety by reason of their criminal record, as evidence of that, I will remove them. I will tell you, there are individuals who are really, really dangerous, who are unlawfully present. And I don't mean to suggest that the majority of the 11 million people fit that profile. Far from it. A incredibly small minority. But it is my job to identify that minority and make sure that the American public and the immigrant communities in the United States, who very well might qualify for immigration reform, don't suffer by reason of that public safety threat.
Yeah, that's a good point. Turning back to audience questions, one is, what are you doing to ensure that ICE is adequately implementing the executive orders put forth by President Biden, and specifically those that were set out in the Pekoski and Johnson memos?
So for everybody's benefit, at the time, the acting secretary had not yet assumed office. On January 20th, the first day of the administration, the acting secretary, David Pekoski, issued a memo promulgating new immigration enforcement priorities. I received that memo on February 2nd. When I did assume office, I took issue with certain elements of it, and I committed to conducting a review, engaging with the workforce and engaging with the community, and critical stakeholders in developing guidelines that were mine, that I would promulgate. And as an interim measure, on February 8th, Tay Johnson, the acting director of ICE, promulgated guidelines that included some of the changes that I thought were necessary as I engaged with the workforce and the stakeholders. Well, I get a report every week of the enforcement actions that ICE has taken to make sure that those actions comport with those guidelines. I review them. I engage with ICE leadership to make sure that they do indeed adhere to the guidelines. And I am engaging with the workforce and the community to promulgate guidelines of mine that will control moving forward.
I'd like to turn to the Middle East now. There's a question from the audience that says, how do you see the current fighting in Israel and Palestine affecting U.S. national security and foreign policy?
Well, I think I will defer to the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, on its impact on our diplomatic efforts, our foreign relations Of course, we take a look at the situation in the Mideast, and quite frankly, everywhere in the world, we're briefed on a daily basis. I start my day every morning with a brief about the security situation around the world, as well as domestically. We're taking a look at how that fighting could impact the homeland, which is what is my area of focus. So we're taking a look at that. We take a look at what threat streams are developing domestically and make our operational decisions accordingly. I have to tell you, it's an extraordinarily sobering way to start the day.
I bet. And how do you balance, I mean, the international versus the domestic threats? Because, you know, just when we think of domestic terrorism, the mass shootings, the domestic violence, police brutality, how do you have to balance that between the real international security threats we also face?
Well, I think, you know, our department is a big department. We have about 250,000 people. We have extraordinary expertise. I do engage in the international arena quite a bit in bilateral relationships, as well as multilateral relationships. In June, I'll be traveling to Portugal for a key meeting with on a multilateral level with a number of ally countries. And so our wingspan is pretty expansive.
You definitely have a lot on your plate. Another question from the audience is talking about the operational organizations that are charged with carrying out the Department of Homeland Security border policy on asylum seekers. So like CPB, INS. Are these organizations actually on board with the new policy positions, or are they obstacles to carrying out the policies?
So it's a great question. I would ask the individual who posed that question the following. If you pulled 30 people together randomly and discussed any number of the policy issues that we've touched upon in this conversation, what do you think the chances are of achieving unanimity in outcome? And I would say mixed, right? And that's what we have. And so in our workforces, we have diversity, including diversity of views. And some are energized by the articulation of direction in this new administration. Others are incredibly discouraged and disagree. And that's a challenge of leadership and a challenge of management. I will tell you, when I led the implementation of DACA in 2000 and in the first term of the Obama Biden administration, there were people in the agency in U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. You know, I served as the director. We had to implement DACA in 60 days. There were people that loved it, were incredibly enthusiastic, and that thought it was an abdication of our legal, in fact, a violation of our legal responsibilities, and didn't like it also as a policy matter. And I knew from experience that I might be able to convince some that it was a great thing to do, but I wouldn't be able to convince all. And so from a management perspective, this is what I said. You know what? I don't care if you love it or you hate it, but I'll tell you this. There are many, many people out there who think that we are not capable of implementing this program in 60 days. A 7% increase in our volume without any additional funding, without any additional operational readiness. You know, we were anticipating 700,000 applications, and we had to build a program, develop the policies, the standard operating procedures, the computer systems to intake that population within 60 days and to start receiving applications. There were many people, most people thought we couldn't do it, and if we did it, we wouldn't do it well. And my rallying cry was, you know what? This is an opportunity to prove them wrong, to reset the table of the agency and to demonstrate the talent and commitment of this workforce. I don't care if you agree with it or not. And so here, we are going to promulgate policies. We are going to execute on the president's vision and the vice president's vision. I have visions of my own, and I am the leader of this agency.
You are also the parent of a Colby student. And so I'd love to hear some thoughts about what Colby means to you. And I'd like to end with, you know, right now on campus, the tents are going up for graduation this weekend. Congratulations, by the way, to all the seniors out there who are about to graduate. We have families coming in for the graduation for the first time, of course, coming to campus in a year. So it's a big moment around here. So I would love to hear your thoughts as a Colby parent, but also just your words of advice for graduation or for graduating Colby students right now.
So I am a Colby parent, incredibly proud of our Colby daughter. And let me say, I corrected my to our, because I do want to say something extraordinarily important, that the achievements of one are possible because of the contributions of others. And I am the Secretary of Homeland Security because of my beautiful, wonderful wife, Tanya. So I think I feel that every single day, and I want to communicate that. You know, one of the things I love about Colby is its motto, because I think its motto, Dare Northward, has profound meaning, not just for the student experience, but for life. To me, you know, I studied literature, history, philosophy. I had a liberal arts education by reason of, well, the reasons were twofold. Number one, it's what I loved. And number two, I was completely incompetent when it came to the sciences and math subjects. So it was perhaps by dint of necessity that I developed that love. But dare means to explore, and exploration is what education is all about. Do you know where your real interests lie and your real passions lie, unless you know what else is out there? The chance to discover is so beautiful and profound. I really mean that, number one. So to dare means to explore. And secondly, daring also means to take risks. And one is going to have to calibrate for oneself what one's risk tolerance is. And perhaps one's risk tolerance will change. It will over time. But if one finds one's passion, and to pursue one's passion involves risk, one has to understand one's tolerance, and maybe it's high, and measure it with respect to one's responsibilities in life and hopefully still be able to dare northward.
Mm. What a beautiful way to end. So dare, explore, take risks. You definitely do that in your life, and that's some really great advice for our Colby graduates. Secretary Mayorkas, thank you very much for your time and also for your leadership and what I assume must be a huge amount of energy and strength for you to get up and do your job every day. We are cheering you on, and you are welcome back to Colby anytime. Thank you to our audience. Thank you for joining us. Have a good night, everybody.
Thanks so much. Have a good night.